I read the most viral book series on Book Talk, Bookstagram, the internet, and spoiler alert, it's not very good. Fourth Wing / the Empyrean review, let's get into it. I did want to make a few disclaimers before I started talking about the books. This is my personal opinion, which may be different from yours. My personal opinion should never be taken as fact, and when I critique a book, it is never a critique on the reader because reading is subjective. If you love these books, I think that is great. Also, you may think these books as reality TV, or you may just want to read them for fun and just shut down from reality and escape into these books, and that is totally fine. But reading it for fun shouldn't be the only valid way to read it. There can still be critiques on that book. Negative reviews of books are just as important as positive ones, and reading a book for fun and critiquing it are not mutually exclusive. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to break down this review into a few parts. The first half is going to be my general thoughts and will be spoiler free. So if you're interested in hearing just generally what I thought about these books and want to decide for yourself, then stick to the first half of the video. I will talk about each book individually in the spoiler free part and then group all the spoilers together for the end. Before I get into any spoilers, I will say it and give you a verbal warning. Starting with book 1, Fourth Wing. Before I get into my thoughts, here is the synopsis of the book. It's set in a fictional fantasy world where the kingdom of Navarre has been at war for over 400 years. And the story follows Violet Soaringale, the female main character, as she prepares to join the Scribe Quadrant, which is basically their historians. They record the history of the kingdoms. But her mom, the general, forces her to join the War College to become a dragon rider in the Riders Quadrant. And so she needs to undergo all these mental and physical trials in order to become a dragon rider. Not only does she have to worry about her physical health because she has very brittle bones, but she also has to worry about Xaden, a wing leader in the Riders Quadrant, who might just be looking to unalive her for being the general's daughter. I do want to say this is the first romantasy book that I ever picked up as a previously only romance reader. So I really loved this book when I first read it. It's so entertaining and captivating. The story and the plot move really fast. The romance is really great. It's a rivals to lovers trope. And I think the banter is really great and the world is set up in a really easy to follow way, and there's just a lot of action in the book in general. Now that I've read more romantasy and just fantasy in general, I don't think this book would hold up the same. I do think it's a great beginner's book for anyone who's interested in dabbling in fantasy or reading more fantasy books, but for those who also want romance as a big part of the story. So with all those factors combined, I really like this book and I was really looking forward to the second book. Which brings us to Iron Flame, which was terribly repetitive with a redundant romance plot and a lack of proper world building. There were a lot of moments where there were just scenes that didn't add a lot to the story. And then suddenly the story felt really rushed, like something needed to happen, so everything kind of just was thrown in at the end. And the characters just weren't as interesting anymore. I just lost all emotional connection to them in this book. This is one of those instances where the last 100 pages does make up for the very poor beginning and very lackluster middle. Ending was interesting enough where I was pretty excited about the third book because I really wanted to see where the story was going. Which brings us to the third book, Onyx Storm. And this is where I realized, okay, Rebecca Yarros, I don't know what she's doing, but she's not a very good writer. Now, this is not a complete series. This is supposed to be a 5-book series, but I feel like books 2 and 3 are just stuffed with filler. They're very repetitive, and I feel like it's just trying to get to that word count, trying to get books 2 and 3 out so we can kind of add a middle section to the story. None of the characters seem to be getting proper character development. There are already a lot of characters in the first 2 books, and this book introduces even more characters that the time to develop them is just split amongst all of them. And the main characters just remain in their archetypal roles that just make for very linear character arcs. There is some more world building in this book, which I think is one of the few good things about it, but it cycles between dialogue and plot that doesn't really add anything substantial to the story, and romance scenes to try to fill up the page count, and then it just dumps a lot of information. So that makes for pretty poor world building in my opinion. And I feel like the writing just doesn't fit the world, and I started noticing that in book 2, but it's definitely apparent in book 1 as well, and definitely apparent in book 3. It just feels very millennial and lost. And it reads like young adult trapped in an adult book. She uses very modern dialogue, but the setting is fictional, so there just feels like a big disconnect between the world and the dialogue and the writing. And now I'll get into the spoilers for all 3 books. Starting with the romance. The romance is probably the most repetitive part in books 2 and 3. In the first book, it's rivals to lovers, so at the end they end up together and they become a couple. And I feel like there's only so much you can do with a romance plot after they end up together. So in the second book, it's a lot of back and forth, fighting and mistrust, and the whole conversation of tell me your secrets, but you have to ask the right questions, and it's just a lot of back and forth. In the third book, it's just a lot of obsession with each other, and it's just a lot of them saying, I don't know how much more I can love this person, and it's just really exhausting. A lot of characters also felt like they were written for death. So Liam, her mom in the second book, Traeger, and Quinn, who I don't really even remember who that is in the third book. I didn't have an ounce of care for any of those characters because they weren't properly developed. They didn't get a full character arc, and they were just written to die off. I think Dane is actually the only interesting character that has a little bit of potential, and honestly, he should just end up with Violet, because at least that would be something added to the story. Violet, the main character, is meant to have this very clever academic brain and way of thinking, but she manages to make the worst decisions. By the third book, she is just the most insufferable main character I've ever read. In the third book, I think the island hopping concept is really interesting, but it was just so poorly executed. There wasn't any proper world building for each of the islands that they visited or the characters that were introduced on those islands. Everything just felt very rushed when that was the opportunity to add a lot to the story to make it stand out. The ending of the third book may be one of the worst book endings that I've had the displeasure of reading, because essentially it's the same ending as the second book, but with less of a build-up and a battle leading into it. And of course, at the end, Violet and Xaden are married because yes, let's just pile on every single trope that we can think of into this already confusing and complicated story. And it just seems like it's trying to make the ending as shocking as possible when you could probably see this from a mile away. In the end, I do think the story had so much potential. It could have been a really amazing series if it was kept as a trilogy and was just fully fleshed out. But instead, it just feels like the story is being dragged on with a lot of filler added with no end in sight. Because one, they'll make a lot of money because there are a lot of fans of the series, so even if this ended up being a 10-book series, people will still buy it. They will still make money. So what do you think? Did you read this? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Are you planning to read it? Let me know.